concussion in the absolute. They did not open their lips again during the whole space of their ride. What did Jean Valjean want? To finish what he had begun. To warn Cosette, to tell her where Marius was, to give her, possibly, some other useful information, to take, if he could, certain final measures. As for himself, so far as he was personally concerned, all was over. He had been seized by Javert and had not resisted. Any other man than himself in like situation would, perhaps, have had some vague thoughts connected with the rope which Thénardier had given him, and of the bars of the first cell that he should enter. But, let us impress it upon the reader, after the bishop, there had existed in Jean Valjean a profound hesitation in the presence of any violence, even when directed against himself. Suicide, that mysterious act of violence against the unknown which may contain, in a measure, the death of the soul, was impossible to Jean Valjean. At the entrance to the Rue de l'Homme Armé, the carriage halted, the way being too narrow to admit of the entrance of vehicles. Javert and Jean Valjean alighted. The coachman humbly represented to Monsieur l'Inspector, that the Utrecht velvet of his carriage was all spotted with the blood of the assassinated man, and with mire from the assassin. That is the way he understood it. He added that an indemnity was due him. At the same time, drawing his certificate book from his pocket, he begged the inspector to have the goodness to write him a bit of an attestation. Javert thrust aside the book which the coachman held out to him, and said, "How much do you want, including your time of waiting and the drive?" "It comes to 7 hours and a quarter," replied the man, "and my velvet was perfectly new." 80 francs, Mr. Inspector. Javert drew 4 napoleons from his pocket and dismissed the carriage. Jean Valjean fancied that it was Javert's intention to conduct him on foot to the post of the Blancs Manteaux or to the post of the Archives, both of which are close at hand. They entered the street. It was deserted as usual. Javert followed Jean Valjean. They reached No. 7. Jean Valjean knocked. The door opened. "It is well," said Javert. "Go upstairs." He added with a strange expression, and as though he were exerting an effort in speaking in this manner, "I will wait for you here." Jean Valjean looked at Javert. This mode of procedure was but little in accord with Javert's habits. However, he could not be greatly surprised that Javert should now have a sort of haughty confidence in him. The confidence of the cat which grants the mouse liberty to the length of its claws, seeing that Jean Valjean had made up his mind to surrender himself and to make an end of it. He pushed open the door, entered the house, called to the porter who was in bed and who had pulled the cord from his couch. "It is I," and ascended the stairs. On arriving at the first floor, he paused. All sorrowful roads have their stations. The window on the landing place, which was a sash window, was open. As in many ancient houses, the staircase got its light from without and had a view on the street. The street lantern, situated directly opposite, cast some light on the stairs, and thus effected some economy in illumination. Jean Valjean, either for the sake of getting the air, or mechanically, thrust his head out of this window. He leaned out over the street. It is short, and the lantern lighted it from end to end. Jean Valjean was overwhelmed with amazement. There was no longer anyone there. Javert had taken his departure. Chapter 12. The Grandfather. Basque and the porter had carried Marius into the drawing-room, as he still lay stretched out, motionless, on the sofa upon which he had been placed on his arrival. The doctor who had been sent for had hastened thither. Aunt Gillenormand had risen. Aunt Gillenormand went and came, in a fright, wringing her hands and incapable of doing anything but saying, "Heavens! Is it possible?" At times she added, "Everything will be covered with blood." When her first horror had passed off, a certain philosophy of the situation penetrated her mind, and took form in the exclamation, "It was bound to end in this way." She did not go so far as, "I told you so," which is customary on this sort of occasion. At the physician's orders, a camp bed had been prepared beside the sofa. The doctor examined Marius. And after having found that his pulse was still beating, that the wounded man had no very deep wound on his breast, and that the blood on the corners of his lips proceeded from his nostrils, he had him placed flat on the bed, without a pillow, with his head on the same level as his body, and even a trifle lower, and with his bust bare in order to facilitate respiration. Mademoiselle Gillenormand, on perceiving that they were undressing Marius, withdrew. She set herself to telling her beads in her own chamber. The trunk had not suffered any internal injury. A bullet, deadened by the pocket-book, had turned aside and made the tour of his ribs with a hideous laceration, which was of no great depth, and consequently, not dangerous. The long, underground journey had completed the dislocation of the broken collarbone, and the disorder there was serious. The arms had been slashed with saber cuts. Not a single scar disfigured his face. But his head was fairly covered with cuts. What would be the result of these wounds on the head? Would they stop short at the hairy cuticle, or would they attack the brain? As yet, this could not be decided. A grave symptom was that they had caused a swoon, and that people do not always recover from such swoons. Moreover, the wounded man had been exhausted by hemorrhage. From the waist down, the barricade had protected the lower part of the body from injury. Basque and Nicolette tore up linen and prepared bandages. Nicolette sewed them, Basque rolled them. As lint was lacking, the doctor, for the time being, arrested the bleeding with layers of wadding. Beside the bed, 3 candles burned on a table where the case of surgical instruments lay spread out. The doctor bathed Marius' face and hair with cold water. A full pail was reddened in an instant. The porter, candle in hand, lighted them. The doctor seemed to be pondering sadly. From time to time, he made a negative sign with his head, as though replying to some question which he had inwardly addressed to himself. A bad sign for the sick man are these mysterious dialogues of the doctor with himself. At the moment when the doctor was wiping Marius' face, and lightly touching his still closed eyes with his finger, a door opened at the end of the drawing room, and a long, pallid figure made its appearance. This was the grandfather. The revolt had, for the past 2 days, deeply agitated, enraged and engrossed the mind of M. Gillenormand. He had not been able to sleep on the previous night, and he had been in a fever all day long. In the evening, he had gone to bed very early, recommending that everything in the house should be well barred, and he had fallen into a doze through sheer fatigue. Old men sleep lightly. M. Gillenormand's chamber adjoined the drawing room, and in spite of all the precautions that had been taken, the noise had awakened him. Surprised at the rift of light which he saw under his door, he had risen from his bed, and had groped his way thither. He stood astonished on the threshold, one hand on the handle of the half-open door. With his head bent a little forward and quivering, his body wrapped in a white dressing gown, which was straight and as destitute of folds as a winding sheet. And he had the air of a phantom who is gazing into a tomb. He saw the bed, and on the mattress that young man. Bleeding, white with a waxen whiteness, with closed eyes and gaping mouth, and pallid lips, stripped to the waist, slashed all over with crimson wounds, motionless and brilliantly lighted up. The grandfather trembled from head to foot as powerfully as ossified limbs can tremble. His eyes, whose cornea were yellow on account of his great age, were veiled in a sort of vitreous glitter. His whole face assumed in an instant the earthy angles of a skull. His arms fell pendant, as though a spring had broken. And his amazement was betrayed by the outspreading of the fingers of his 2 aged hands, which quivered all over. His knees formed an angle in front, allowing, through the opening in his dressing gown, a view of his poor bare legs, all bristling with white hairs, and he murmured, "Marius." "Sir," said Basque, "Monsieur has just been brought back. He went to the barricade, and he is dead," cried the old man in a terrible voice. "Ah! The rascal!" Then a sort of sepulchral transformation straightened up this centenarian as erect as a young man. "Sir," said he, "you are the doctor. Begin by telling me one thing. He is dead, is he not? The doctor, who was at the highest pitch of anxiety, remained silent. Gilliner Mand wrung his hands with an outburst of terrible laughter. He is dead! He is dead! He is dead! He has got himself killed on the barricades. Out of hatred to me. He did that to spite me. Ah! You blood drinker! This is the way he returns to me. Misery of my life, he is dead. He went to the window, threw it wide open as though he were stifling, and, erect before the darkness, he began to talk into the street, to the night. Pierced, sabred, exterminated, slashed, hacked in pieces. Just look at that, the villain. He knew well that I was waiting for him, and that I had had his room arranged, and that I had placed at the head of my bed his portrait taken when he was a little child. He knew well that he had only to come back. And that I had been recalling him for years, and that I remained by my fireside, with my hands on my knees, not knowing what to do, and that I was mad over it. You knew well, that you had but to return and to say, "It is I," and you would have been the master of the house, and that I should have obeyed you, and that you could have done whatever you pleased with your old numbskull of a grandfather. You knew that well, and you said, "No, he is a royalist, I will not go." And you went to the barricades, and you got yourself killed out of malice. To revenge yourself for what I said to you about Monsieur le Duc de Berry. It is infamous. Go to bed then and sleep tranquilly. He is dead, and this is my awakening. The doctor, who was beginning to be uneasy in both quarters, quitted Marius for a moment, went to Gilliner Mand, and took his arm. The grandfather turned round, gazed at him with eyes which seemed exaggerated in size and bloodshot, and said to him calmly, "I thank you, sir. I am composed, I am a man, I witnessed the death of Louis XVI. I know how to bear events. One thing is terrible, and that is to think that it is your newspapers which do all the mischief. You will have scribblers, chatterers, lawyers, orators, tribunes, discussions, progress, enlightenment, the rights of man, the liberty of the press, and this is the way that your children will be brought home to you. Ah! Marius! It is abominable. Killed. Dead before me. A barricade. Ah, the scamp! Doctor, you live in this quarter, I believe? Oh! I know you well. I see your cabriolet pass my window. I am going to tell you. You are wrong to think that I am angry. One does not fly into a rage against a dead man. That would be stupid. This is a child whom I have reared. I was already old while he was very young. He played in the Tuileries garden with his little shovel and his little chair. And in order that the inspectors might not grumble, I stopped up the holes that he made in the earth with his shovel, with my cane. One day he exclaimed, "Down with Louis XVIII!" And off he went. It was no fault of mine. He was all rosy and blonde. His mother is dead. Have you ever noticed that all little children are blonde? Why is it so? He is the son of one of those brigands of the lawyer, but children are innocent of their father's crimes. I remember when he was no higher than that. He could not manage to pronounce his ds. He had a way of talking that was so sweet and indistinct that you would have thought it was a bird chirping. I remember that once, in front of the Hercules Farnese, people formed a circle to admire him and marvel at him. He was so handsome, was that child. He had a head such as you see in pictures. I talked in a deep voice, and I frightened him with my cane, but he knew very well that it was only to make him laugh. In the morning, when he entered my room, I grumbled, but he was like the sunlight to me, all the same. One cannot defend oneself against those brats. They take hold of you, they hold you fast, they never let you go again. The truth is, that there never was a Cupid like that child. Now, what can you say for your Lafayettes, your Benjamin Constants, and your Tirquere de Courcelles who have killed him? This cannot be allowed to pass in this fashion. He approached Marius, who still lay livid and motionless, and to whom the physician had returned, and began once more to wring his hands. The old man's pallid lips moved as though mechanically, and permitted the passage of words that were barely audible, like breaths in the death agony. Ah! Heartless lad! Ah! Club Bist! Ah! Reg! Ah! Septembrist! Reproaches in the low voice of an agonizing man, addressed to a corpse. Little by little. As it is always indispensable that internal eruptions should come to the light. The sequence of words returned, but the grandfather appeared no longer to have the strength to utter them. His voice was so weak, and extinct, that it seemed to come from the other side of an abyss. It is all the same to me, I am going to die too, that I am. And to think that there is not a hussy in Paris who would not have been delighted to make this wretch happy. A scamp who, instead of amusing himself and enjoying life, went off to fight and get himself shot down like a brute. And for whom? Why? For the Republic. Instead of going to dance at the Chaumiere, as it is the duty of young folks to do. What's the use of being 20 years old? The Republic, accursed pretty folly. Poor mothers, beget fine boys, do. Come, he is dead. That will make 2 funerals under the same carriage gate. So you have got yourself arranged like this for the sake of General Lamarque's handsome eyes. What had that General Lamarque done to you? A slasher. A chatterbox. To get oneself killed for a dead man. If that isn't enough to drive anyone mad. Just think of it. At 20. And without so much as turning his head to see whether he was not leaving something behind him. That's the way poor, good old fellows are forced to die alone, nowadays. Perish in your corner, owl. Well, after all, so much the better, that is what I was hoping for, this will kill me on the spot. I am too old, I am 100 years old, I am 100,000 years old, I ought, by rights, to have been dead long ago. This blow puts an end to it. So all is over, what happiness! What is the good of making him inhale ammonia and all that parcel of drugs? You are wasting your trouble, you fool of a doctor. Come, he's dead, completely dead. I know all about it, I am dead myself too. He hasn't done things by half. Yes. This age is infamous. Infamous, and that's what I think of you. Of your ideas. Of your systems. Of your masters. Of your oracles. Of your doctors. Of your scapegraces of writers, of your rascally philosophers, and of all the revolutions which, for the last 60 years, have been frightening the flocks of crows in the Tuileries. But you were pitiless in getting yourself killed like this. I shall not even grieve over your death, do you understand, you assassin? At that moment, Marius slowly opened his eyes, and his glance, still dimmed by lethargic wonder, rested on M. Gilliner Mand. Marius! Cried the old man. Marius! My little Marius! My child! My well-beloved son! You open your eyes, you gaze upon me, you are alive, thanks! And he fell fainting.